Election 2006, the 2nd District Congressional Race. Republican incumbent Jim Ryan faces Democratic challenger Nancy Boyda. The moderator for tonight's discussion is Bob Beatty, professor of political science at Washburn University.
Good evening and welcome to Election 2006. Tonight we'll look at the candidates for the 2nd District Congressional seat. Congressman Jim Ryan is currently serving his 5th term in Congress, representing the 2nd District of Kansas. He is a member of the Armed Services, Budget, and Financial Services Committees. Nancy Boyda holds degrees in both chemistry and education. She worked as a chemist for the Environmental Protection Agency and has held management positions with a number of pharmaceutical companies. In 2002, Boyda ran for the 2nd District Congressional seat, losing to incumbent Jim Ryan. Scheduling conflicts prevented us from having both candidates together in our studio. Instead, we interviewed the two candidates and asked them identical questions and taped their responses. Over the next hour, you'll hear their answers and hear from our guest panelists who are with me tonight in our studio. They are Tim Carpenter, writer for the Topeka Capital Journal, Peter Hancock, State House Bureau Chief for Kansas Public Radio, and Rick Anderson, political columnist for the Topeka Capital Journal. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Let's get right down to the questions. The first question we posed to the two candidates was on foreign policy and specifically about what's going on in Afghanistan with the rise of the Taliban.
Important that we continue to fight the war on terrorism. Afghanistan is one of those fronts. The terrorists recognize if they have a victory there that it will embolden their base, it will embolden them to continue to be aggressive throughout the rest of the world. So I've supported our troops. We continue to make sure they have the right kind of supplies, the right kind of equipment, whatever they need to continue to fight the war on terrorism. I think they're doing a great job.
First of all, when 9/11 hit, I'm a mom and I was worried sick about where my family was and if they were safe. And going into Afghanistan certainly made sense to go in there. We had to have a firm response to 9/11 and let the world know that we were not going to put up with that. When we went into Iraq, we were going after a hornet's nest with a baseball bat. And we're seeing just what I was concerned about 4 years ago. We should have been keeping our eye on the ball with Afghanistan. I just can't say that enough. We need to come back now. We have our troops so overextended in Iraq and through the rest of the world that it's getting very, very, very difficult. But we need to work with our military and with this James Baker, very bipartisan Iraq study group to say what are the best use of our limited resources at this point in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the entire Middle East. Certainly we're looking at the Korean Peninsula. There's a whole global war on terror. And our complete concentration in Iraq, I think, has left us more vulnerable. That's exactly what we were talking about 3 years ago.
Well, a congressman or congresswoman has a lot to do with foreign policy. I think we see some differences in their answers. I'll ask the panel. One was the length of the answers, and who'd like to jump in on this one?
Well, one question needs to be raised about Afghanistan in terms of how well things are going. The congressman believes that the troops are doing a great job. I'm not sure the evidence is there to support it. I'm not sure either one of them talked about increasing troop strength or really changing the approach in Afghanistan.
Well, Nancy Boyda's answer was a lot longer, and I am struck by Congressman Ryan's answer being so short, and as you said, essentially saying, we'll give them what they need and they're doing a great job.
Doesn't sound like he's suggesting that the policy there and the approach needs to be changed.
Yeah, I picked up on the same thing. I noticed that neither one of them, but in particular Jim Ryan, did not mention the big problem in Afghanistan is the resurgence of the Taliban in major parts of the country and the fact that poppy and heroin production is now at an all-time high and that they're using the money from their drug production to finance militarizing the Taliban again. And that we went into that country with about 5,000 troops. It's worth noting that the last foreign conqueror who held Afghanistan for any length of time was Genghis Khan. The Russians weren't able to do it with significantly more troops than that. I think you hear Boyda starting to talk about how, and it's a very classic Democratic theme this year, is that we should have concentrated on Afghanistan because that's basically Osama bin Laden and the support that he had. They were the ones who carried out 9/11, and that the war in Iraq was a diversion from that. you heard Congressman Ryan just talk generally about he supports the troops and wants them to have the equipment that they need, but not really much about the war plan in both of those wars.
And is it unfair to ask for detailed explanation of something that might be not going well during an election? It almost seems like Congressman Ryan feels like to admit that things are difficult there is to implicitly say that there's a criticism of his candidacy. Or am I misspeaking on that?
Well, like my colleagues here, I was a little bit surprised about the brevity of his answer, and I think that is an issue among many others that maybe he's trying to distance himself from a bit, with the backlash that we're hearing about against the Republican Party. I was also struck by Nancy Boyda's statement about baseball bat in a hornet's nest. I mean, my feeling is now and always has been that the U.S. troops did an excellent job of winning a war there, but being a peacekeeping force is another issue entirely.
Yeah, and the next question actually is specifically about Iraq, so we may as well go to that. We asked the two candidates after Afghanistan about Iraq, and I should say that in the question I asked that the premise was that the violence was out of control and that there may not be enough American troops there to stop the violence. But on the other side, the training of the Iraqi military and police also may not be going along well enough to stop the violence. That was the premise of the question, so the candidates did respond to that premise.
In Iraq has nothing to do with the military. The military kept trying to say from the beginning that we need to put more troops on the ground, that we have to have an exit strategy, that we're not going to be greeted as liberators. It was naive and absolutely irresponsible of this administration to tell the American people that we were going to be greeted as liberators. This Iraq study group that's being led by bipartisan statesmen, James Baker, Lee Hamilton, people who are known for two things. First of all, their expertise in the area of foreign policy, diplomacy, but what they're really known for is being able to pull together and find solutions. They have the very, very rare distinction of people who have gotten above politics. They are to be making recommendations after this election on what the way forward is in Iraq, and I'm so glad that it's going to be after the election so that we have the best chance of having a non-political, non-partisan answer to the way forward in Iraq. It's a mess right now, and the American people need to understand there aren't any good solutions. When you drive your car over a cliff, your options get pretty limited. So this group that James Baker is leading will come back with the best way forward. I pray, and I mean that literally, that I'm going to be able to get behind their recommendations, and the American people are going to get behind their recommendations. I'll certainly be talking with the military here in the district, active and retired, and I can't tell you how much I pray that we'll be able to support that, unite our country back home, and then move forward.
Well, I would disagree with you to begin with. First of all, they have over 300,000 Iraqi security forces that have been trained, which means you have military police, active duty, and they're up against a very well-funded, well-organized terrorist insurgent group that recognizes that Iraq is one of the fronts on the war on terrorism. In fact, the national intelligence estimate that was illegally leaked indicated that the terrorists were being emboldened by our presence, but it didn't give you the rest of it. That's why the president declassified the rest of it, and he made a point that the terrorists recognize that if we win there, when we win there, it will deflate them. As a result of our presence there are those obviously who are concerned about it, but it also says that the corruption that's going on within the Islamic world is a problem. People want a representation, they want to see things happening, but we're making progress there. I spent time this summer there with our troops, and General Casey made a point. He said, from now on, you will see a spiked increase in violence because the insurgents recognize that about 70% of the people with the purple finger have voted for freedom. You have a government and you have a constitution, and those are recipes in terms of how the terrorists look at it, in terms of success for Iraq, and that means failure for the terrorists. So that's why this is such an important front. They know that. That's why it's important for us to stay in there and do what we can. At the same time, we're not the lead force going in. Of that 320,000, they are the lead force. We're the follow-along force, and they're willing now to take more ownership of the country And it's important that we win the war on terrorism, because if we don't there, it will come our way.
Well, obviously Iraq, a very, very important issue in America today. So let's get right to the panelists. Peter, what did you think of the two answers?
Well, first of all, on Ryan's, he mentioned the 300,000 trained Iraqi security forces. It's worth noting that is a highly disputed figure, and is a considerable amount of dispute about what qualifies as a trained security force. And I think Bob Woodward, in his recent book, talked a lot about that. But then goes on to say that he thinks we're making progress in Iraq and that the war is going well, and generally talks about, when we win in Iraq, we will deflate the terrorists. Boyda, on the other hand, is talking about this supposedly bipartisan report that's going to come out from James Baker and Lee Hamilton. Probably one of the few Democrats you'll ever hear who refers to James Baker as being nonpartisan and a unified. He was the lead attorney for Bush in the Florida recount challenge. But regardless of that, I think the people in Washington, and I think the American people, know what the options are on the table. There aren't a whole lot of options that people haven't heard about already. None of those options seem to have gotten a consensus behind them yet. Maybe the Hamilton and Baker report will be able to build some consensus. She certainly seems to be indicating that's what she hopes for. We'll just have to see when that report comes out.
Congressman seems to be used the word success numerous times. And I think Boyda really is calling that into question. The other thing about Ryan's answers, it seemed like those exact same answers could have been used if this debate were held a year ago. It seems as if conditions in Iraq have changed, and they've changed for the worst. And I'm not sure that Congressman Ryan's answers are reflecting that.
Well, Rick?
Well, I wondered about, maybe I'm drawing the wrong conclusion here, but didn't I hear that there's success being made, but the more success we have, the more violence we're going to see? Maybe I got that wrong, but I'm thinking that if that's the conclusion that's being drawn, that some people might have some questions with that.
Well, yeah, the violence, especially in Baghdad, is atrocious, and I think a problem we're getting with the training of the police and the military is the targeting of recruits and their families, in which literally they're being found beheaded. And again, maybe in 2 minutes we can't get a lot of detail, but I think voters are going to want a lot more, maybe than both of these candidates were willing to talk about.
This is a big issue in the campaign, I think, here and in other states, and you can't minimize it.
Yeah. The next issue was something that Nancy Boyda brought up really at the beginning of her campaign, when she talked about a superhighway coming from Mexico and possibly coming through Kansas. Not a lot of people knew what she was talking about, but it got a lot of buzz in the campaign. So let's hear their candidates' responses to this idea of a superhighway coming through Kansas from Mexico.
This, quite frankly, she started out saying it was a 10-lane highway through Kansas. Now she's saying it's a 10-lane highway through Texas. I've actually had KDOT talk with them, and it's a Democrat organization that, under the governor, has simply said it doesn't exist. In the highway transportation bill, which we reauthorized, it talks about Topeka Boulevard Bridge, of which I've been able to obtain $17 million. It talks about some of the other highway transportation issues, but the superhighway, doesn't exist. In Texas, there is some expansion of the highway. If she wants to represent Texas and concerned about those 10 lanes, let her go to Texas. We've got a lot of work to do up here. I'm happy to represent what's going on here. We have just enough money at this point in time to fill our potholes, continue to make sure I-35 is well taken care of, but there are no plans for a superhighway through Kansas.
Oh, I think it's not a possibility. It's actually happening. This corridor is being built in Texas. They're getting ready to buy the land for it or take the land for it. It's being built by a private consortium of companies called Sintra-Zachry. Sintra is one of the biggest purchasers of the American infrastructure that we have. They bought the Indiana Turnpike about a month ago. Before that, they bought the Ohio Turnpike. So what does it mean to Kansans that they are building this thing? Call Ron Paul, call any of the congressmen down in Texas or any of the races and say, are they building a superhighway? They'll almost laugh at you. Yes, they're building one. This is not something that I'm talking about. This is something that has clearly been in the press and in the conversation a great deal. But what difference does it make if it's in Texas? First of all, it is blowing a 1/4 mile wide hole in our border with Mexico. Are we going to secure the border or open the border? This is clearly intended to completely open the border with Mexico. There will be no way to control what comes across in those containers, whether it's people, drugs, and I know that's such an issue in southeast Kansas, and in the rest of the district too, and weapons. So we're opening up our borders. But the other thing that we have to think about here, this is not about bringing in more cheap goods from Mexico. This is about bringing in more and more cheap goods from Asia. And we're going to be shoving on the accelerator to NAFTA. The last barrier to manufacturing things here in the United States is the transportation cost. They're going to get those so far down that they'll including the tires that we make here at Goodyear right now, are going to be much cheaper to bring in from Asia. I'm deeply concerned that we're going to see our jobs exit the country even faster than we have seen in days past. This NAFTA corridor has huge implications to our country and to Kansas as well.
Well, interesting issue, and also Nancy Boyda turned into a discussion about free trade. Peter, you wanted to talk about this a bit?
Well, I think you heard Jim. First of all, I guess you need to start with Nancy Boyda, who raised this as an issue and says that it's blowing a 1/4 mile hole in our border with Mexico, 2,000-mile long border that is, most people concede, is pretty porous to begin with now. There is, in fact, an organization called the North American Super Corridor Coalition that is actively promoting the development of I-35 and other routes north as an international sort of free trade corridor to enhance trade with Mexico. And the general purpose of it, as I understand it, is, as Nancy Boyda said, to open up another port for Asian goods into the Western Hemisphere. They're currently coming in through Seattle and San Francisco and San Diego, to open one in Mexico where they might get some cheaper labor from longshoremen and ship those up by rail and by truck into the United States through Mexico. Jim Ryan denies that this even exists, and to a point, he has a point. There are no firm plans in either the Kansas Department of Transportation or the U.S. Department of Transportation to build the type of corridor that Boyda is describing in here. There is a privately funded organization that's trying to promote trade along the I-35 corridor. Whether it turns into this 10-lane multimodal super concrete monstrosity from El Paso up to Winnipeg, I don't know, but that's...
Rick, is this an issue that she is using to tap into a general discontent with Congress about the entire trade issues and illegal immigration? Does she sort of get a 2-for-1 out of this?
Well, perhaps. I've always wondered if she may be marginalizing herself among some voters with this issue, because maybe it's a better issue for 2008 when more is known about this project. Right now, I think a lot of voters have a lot of questions about whether this actually exists, and you have to wonder about her insistence on discussing something that maybe a couple of years down the road.
I think she brought it up early in the campaign because she had really not enough to talk about, and this gave her something to get out there on the stump and articulate. I like your point about other issues. She mentioned immigration. You know, if you're building a really that wide of a highway, you're talking about property rights, you know. And so these are,
yes.
yeah, all of these things could, it's either, as she says, the scariest thing to ever happen in Kansas, or it's actually not going to exist at all.
And if the thrust of your campaign is the idea that Washington is ignoring the interests of the people, and you bring up something that is a little strange and sounds a little odd, but the response from the incumbent is, oh, it's a hoax. That almost feeds into, you know, this idea, well, maybe they're ignoring this too. And as you said, though, it was one of the first things she brought up in the campaign.
But as Rick says, it also runs the danger of kind of marginalizing her, because if it is this huge national issue or international issue, Why is it only in the 2nd District of Kansas that it's being talked about? Why isn't this on the radar screen of congressional districts all throughout the Mississippi Valley?
And one of the issues that it taps into is one that we did talk to the candidates about, and one we see in both of their television ads. In fact, one of the new ads out by Jim Ryan specifically speaks to this issue, which is illegal immigration, what to do about it, and the candidates' responses and what they've said about illegal immigration.
That's a very simple question. It is completely about cheap labor. This country is absolutely addicted to cheap labor, and they have no intention, and I think, again, this NAFTA super corridor, there's no intention to close the border in any meaningful way. And every coffee shop that I go into, do you know what the topic of conversation is? Illegal immigration. People are scratching their heads going, why haven't they done anything about it? Why aren't they doing anything about it? And what can we do? I think the people up in Washington, D.C. are just laughing at us. There is no intention. They want the cheap labor. So we'll go down and we'll build some fences. We'll put some people, although we're starting to bring back our National Guard from different states so that our Border Patrol is already thinning out again. They'll throw some money at it, throw some bills at it to make the American people feel like they're trying. But there is, I truly believe, no real intention to do anything about the underlying problem of illegal immigration, because the desire for cheap labor is so strong that they're going to keep this as it has been in the past. And there will be no substantial change until we get people in who are willing to stand up to these big corporations and say, we're stopping this. Somebody asked me if the immigration issue was going to go away after the election. It was a reporter. I said, absolutely not. This is not anything that's going on in Congress. This is the people coming together and saying, we have had enough. Port security, immigration, we want control back. We're law-abiding people, and we want to make sure that other people are made to abide by the laws, both the workers and the employers. This is a tremendously important issue to people for many, many reasons. I ask as much as I can. We have a huge problem, and Jim Ryan has done really nothing to address this over the years. But I ask people constantly, as we address this huge problem, let's bring down the hate rhetoric. We don't need to do it in a hateful way. It's going to be hard. It's going to be tough. Good people are going to get hurt. But we've got to do the right thing and get control of our borders and control of immigration.
Well, let me say this. I have worked on this since 2000 in terms of various measures related to immigration or terrorism. Roughly 13 bills I've either voted for or co-sponsored. In fact, if we'd had the real ID, it would have kept Muhammad Atta, for example, from having roughly 30 IDs. And that was voted down by the Democrats. They didn't want to see that in there. We did pass it, though. You know, various measures like that have been important in terms of fighting terrorism. But I have worked on, in fact, I have voted for a border security, more Border Patrol. I have voted for a fence there. And that's one of the things that distinguishes me from my opponent. She doesn't want any fence. She doesn't want any new laws. She has talked about it being a pathway to citizenship, which when I go through the 2nd District and talk about that to other people, they all say, well, that's amnesty. And I say, that's what it is. I do not support amnesty. I believe we need to tighten the borders. We are on the southern border. We're training more Border Patrol. We're working on an appropriate fence with other types of detection. We're also securing the northern border, and we'll continue to advance with some of the answers that need to be done. But at this point in time, I have done a good amount of work on this, and we'll continue to ensure that we secure the borders first.
And I should add that part of the question I posed to the candidates was why nothing significant had been done to allow 12 million illegal immigrants to come into the country in the past few years. So their answers reflect that. But who wants to chime in on this big issue of illegal immigration?
The congressman didn't actually address the point that Boyda made, that the United States is addicted to cheap labor. I think she's right on the money with that. You go around to various parts of Kansas and ask the local Chamber of Commerce or the guy trying to hire people in the labor force, and you'll find a lot of them don't want to run immigrant labor out of the country. They're having a hard enough time filling these jobs. So, you know, I think she's right about cheap labor, and I wish the congressman could have addressed that issue in his remarks.
Yeah, I think he heard two buzzwords in there: cheap labor and amnesty. Both sides have realized that these words pull very well among certain demographics in the United States. As Tim pointed out, you wouldn't have this flood of people coming into the United States if somebody wasn't making money off of it. They're coming up here to get jobs.
Why would they come? Yeah.
12 million people, which is roughly the population of Ohio, it's estimated that's how many illegal immigrants are here. Ryan voted for the House version of an immigration bill that would declare anybody who is in the United States illegally a felon. And that conjured up the image of trying to round up 11 to 12 million people and do what with them? Put them in prison, ship them back on rail cars, or fly them back to wherever they came from. That wasn't entirely clear. But he pulls out the buzzword amnesty, and he says, if you're talking about trying to make them citizens, or if you're talking about any sort of guest worker program, that's amnesty, which immediately has conjures up emotional reactions in the people who feel threatened by the presence of illegal immigrants and illegal labor in the United States.
Rick?
My thought was when Nancy Boyda talks about the solution being to crack down on the corporations that are hiring, I wonder if that is all-encompassing. I wonder if you can look at it from a corporate level. I know that there are employers out there who certainly don't reach the corporate level who are hiring illegal immigrants and who are making them part of their business. I guess what I'm saying is I think the problem goes well beyond the corporate level. It goes to the small businessman. It goes to entire communities. My other thought was I'm not sure, based on his record, that you can say that Jim Ryan has essentially done nothing about illegal immigration, and I'm not trying to be a cheerleader here, but I think the record would show that he has voted in favor of a number of illegal immigration crackdown issues.
I think November 7th will be very interesting because, of course, Jim Ryan is in the majority party, and rightly or wrongly, there does come times in United States politics where people just get fed up that something hasn't happened, whether it's a good solution or sometimes not. And you may be right that if that sense is out there, just being in the majority might be difficult for him, even if he has, as you said, voted for particular bills.
Boyda might be lucky this year in that she could be at the upper end of that cycle, and they could just be, to her gain, throwing Republicans out of office because.
Well, I think that's part of her campaign strategy. An interesting aspect about being representing the 2nd District is that you'd be the congressperson for the Topeka area, which is the home of the Westboro Baptist Church. And they've been in the national news for picketing of military servicemen and women's funerals. So we asked both candidates, their take and on this issue of the picketing of funerals, and if there's anything they would have thought about doing to be for or against this phenomenon.
Well, I have voted against their ability to picket. I support the Patriot Guard. Our servicemen and women who die in those funerals that they protest in, I think it's such a disrespectful situation. Here they have sacrificed for our country, standing in harm's way, and I think it's an inappropriate place to do what they're doing, and I continue to do what I can to help the Patriot Guard.
I find, with Kansans everywhere and Americans, I am just appalled at this group. They do have the ability to have free speech, but I cannot find it in my heart to even understand how anybody could go and protest somebody who has given their life for this country. We learned this afternoon that we have lost another soldier from Leavenworth, and I cannot even imagine what's going to happen if they try to go up to Leavenworth, Kansas. It's not going to be pretty. We have the bikers that come in and provide the support, and I know that means so much to the families. When I'm in Congress, you said if, I'll go ahead and say when. When I'm in Congress, I'll do whatever I can to provide that emotional support to the families, and certainly be working together to say, what can we do to have legislation on the national level that keeps this kind of behavior from happening without infringing on the free speech rights of Americans. But it is disgraceful and despicable, and I am embarrassed that they're from Topeka, Kansas.
Yeah, there's a fascinating set of responses, in my opinion. Nancy Boyda uses much more strong words to talk about this issue, whereas Congressman Ryan, it was pretty straightforward. He supports the Patriot Guard.
They sound to be, to me, more or less the same place, though. They're against the picketing, and they would endorse legislation that would curtail that. I think they're going to have a heck of a hard time writing a bill that is actually constitutional that prohibits this picketing, because public streets and public sidewalks are public spaces. And a lot of funeral homes, unfortunately, are in cities with public streets and sidewalks surrounding them. And the picketers are going to have access to those spaces. So they can talk about legislation, but I don't really see where they can actually do anything. The Kansas legislature tried to pass a bill this past session, and they didn't. Other states did, but Kansas didn't. Why? Because they knew the Phelps would challenge it in court, and they sensed that the Phelps would win that challenge, and the money won in that legal decision would actually go to finance funeral picketing around the country.
Right.
I have to agree. This is one of our fundamental rights, obviously, and it's something that, as Tim said, there's been a lot of struggle about at the state level, where I think we know the church and Reverend Phelps a little bit better than perhaps other states do, know their tendency to file lawsuits. So. As far as crafting something that would not infringe on free speech rights, as reprehensible as this practice may be, I'm not sure how you do it.
I guess the question was because the congressperson from this district, as you mentioned, actually represents this area in the church. The mayor of Topeka, Bill Bunton, actually sends out letters to communities across the nation discussing this issue. And I guess the question was really trying to get at, how do you approach this when you're representing this area?
Well, I thought what was interesting about both of the answers was that they're both against funeral picketing. They're both in favor of the Patriot Guard, and those are not risky positions to take. But nobody really talked about, as Tim and Rick have both mentioned, how tough it is to balance the interests of families and the interests of propriety against the First Amendment right to free speech. Kansas actually does have a funeral picketing law. We passed it a number of years ago in response to the same group protesting and picketing outside the funerals of AIDS victims. I'm often asking myself, where was the national outrage then? Where was the push in Congress to do something about it when we were talking about AIDS victims that they were picketing at? The other thing that occurs to me is, having grown up in Independence, Missouri in the 60s and early 70s, I remember the funeral of former President Harry Truman. I remember watching on TV the funerals of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King and seeing the throngs of people at those funerals holding up signs, waving flags as the funeral procession came by in support of the people who had died. Signs that said, "We love you, Harry," and the shows of support. And you have to understand that these laws they paint with a very broad stroke. If you can't protest, you can't protest at all. And very often in American history, at the funerals of fallen heroes and national leaders, there have been huge outpourings of support along the funeral processions. FDR's funeral train going back to Washington, Abraham Lincoln's funeral train going back to Springfield. The idea of demonstrating and showing some sort of emotion at a funeral as a national response is not uncommon. So these laws would paint with a broad stroke.
Yeah, and it's interesting in the 2nd District to have that vantage point of what's become a national issue. Another national issue, one that Congressman Ryan actually led his television advertising campaign off with, is the energy issue, and the idea of possibilities for alternative fuel sources rather than the dependence on foreign countries for energy.
We have an addiction to oil. We have to admit that first and foremost. It's not hard to understand why. The oil and gas, and I'm talking about the huge oil and gas industry, they've set energy policy for so many decades that we are in a corner. We're dependent on fossil fuels, and certainly we're dependent on foreign oil and oil from the Middle East. We have the ability to turn that around in the next, I think, 18 to 24 months. And that is to revamp our energy policy. Just like when Jack Kennedy in 1962 said, we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And 7 years later, we had an American astronaut standing on the surface of the moon. I believe, and most Kansans and most Americans believe, the technology is already there. But we keep on subsidizing oil and gas more and more and more, and we don't have a balance. It has to be three prongs. There has to be oil and gas, but the alternate fuels and the conservation technologies that we could have been developing for decades, we need to bring those to the forefront. It will do so much if we can do that. It will focus us. It will remind every seventh grader why they need to study math and science, because they're going to go and develop these new technologies. It will bring jobs here, keep jobs here, and it will bring some sense of hope back to America that we're on the cutting edge of things. Other countries have moved so far beyond us already that we are behind the power curve already. I think if we can get our act together in the next 18 to 24 months in a bipartisan way, that we can still grab on and get back that leadership position for developing new technologies. But we can't wait. We can't wait.
First of all, I have voted for alternative fuels. Ethanol, for example, is something that I've helped support. We have a plant in Garnett, and I will continue to look for the development of more plants like that. I have encouraged conservation. We need to continue to do what we can along the way to conserve. And I've also encouraged exploration. You know, we need to recognize that, you know, we have great resources in this country, and one of the reasons that we have such a great dependency upon foreign oil is we're not taking advantage of those. Anwar in Alaska, for example, is a very desolate, remote area that's about 40 miles from an existing pipeline. We could access that, help reduce some of our dependency upon foreign oil, at the same time be able to connect into an already existing pipeline. But we need to also, and I've actually worked on and voted for what is called the Gas Act. And that really addresses part of the problem we have is that we don't have enough refineries in this country. The state of Kansas used to have like 15 to 16 refineries. Now we have about 2, and that's really been true of refineries across this country. So in December of last year, I helped pass the Gas Act, which would simply say we can put online more environmentally friendly refineries to help reduce our dependency upon foreign oil. So those are some of the measures I've worked on. We'll continue to work on it. The more we can reduce our dependency upon foreign oil, the better we will be off for the future.
Well, both candidates packed a lot into their respective 2 minutes. How do voters sort out what these two candidates said?
Let me summarize what I think I just heard. I think Boyda mentioned conservation and restricting consumption, and the congressman several times mentioned production expansion is the way to ease this addiction to foreign oil. And so maybe a greater balance between both of those two. Maybe if they actually put their heads together in a bipartisan way, they could come up with a good energy policy that might help the country.
Well, if the Democrats were to win the House and Nancy Boyda were to win, she's going to have to remember a lot of this talk about bipartisanship, because you do wonder if Democrats win the House, if they're going to be so eager to be bipartisan. But we don't know. Maybe that would be part of their strategy if they were to do that. Rick, did you see anything in these answers that struck you as something a voter could put their hat on?
Well, what I wonder is, as maybe a typical voter, is what are the free market forces that are already driving this issue? I mean, obviously, people are already driving hybrid vehicles. You're starting to see more production of these things. What policies would the candidates have to encourage more of that free market development of these kind of fuel-saving devices? That's what struck me the most, I think.
I'm still trying to figure out what environmentally friendly refineries are, and how Ryan also talked about how he has encouraged conservation, but didn't necessarily mention any specific bills or legislation that he had supported, such as bills that might impose higher fuel efficiency standards on SUVs and other fuel-consuming vehicles. Nancy Boyda has said we have 18 to 24 months to revamp our energy policy. Never really gave you a clear idea of what that policy ought to be. or what our policy is now. I'm not entirely sure we have a national energy policy, except by default that it just is what it is. She didn't talk about, as many Democrats have talked about in the past, Vice President Dick Cheney's task force that got together early in the administration, met in secret. It evidently had large number of people from the oil industry taking part in it. She didn't really talk about that. She just says we're addicted to oil and we need to find something else. Didn't get a clear indication really of where she wanted to go.
And this is a problem probably more particularly with the House, because House elections are every 2 years. And if gas prices go up, it becomes a big issue. Gas prices go down, a number of people say, well, we have other things to worry about. In fact, so much so that Congressman Ryan's first ad, he talks about, well, gas prices are getting high. At the very moment, they were actually going down to where they are now. They had been higher earlier. And I think that mitigates against a long-term energy strategy, as you talked about.
I think people are going to remember $3 a gallon gasoline for a long time. Even though it's not $3 a gallon now, they remember that it was just a few months ago and it could easily go back up there again. And I think this is an issue that for voters, it sticks with a lot of voters because individuals, consumers are so powerless about this situation. Gas can spike up to $3 a gallon. It could go to $4 a gallon. Your wages are not going to go up commensurate with that instantly to cover the cost. So I think a lot of people feel vulnerable to this issue, even though it may not be acute right now. It could be very soon again.
Another issue that's been around for a number of years, all the way back to Ross Perot in 1992, is the budget deficit and spending. It's an issue that's been there for when Democrats have been in charge and Republicans in charge in Congress. So we asked the two candidates, as Congress people, or potentially, what about the spending in Washington, D.C. and controlling some of the spending so the budget deficit might go down in the next few years?
Well, Bob, I have gone after deficit spending since 2003, and partly because of the tax relief that I have helped pass that has impacted positively the 2nd District. There are greater tax receipts. As a percentage of GDP, in 2003 it was roughly 3.6% was what the deficit was. With the numbers that just came out from the Labor Department last month, we paid down another $248 billion of money. As a result of that, we shrunk from 3.6 to 1.9% of total GDP. So what we're doing is we're reducing the deficit. I'd like to see it go even further south and, obviously reduce it more. And I will continue to vote that way. I have helped put together a budget as a result of being a part of the Budget Committee, passed it through the House, make sure it gives us some guidelines. I know that being as a part of the Budget Committee, it's really interesting working with Democrats on the Budget Committee. They never make a budget proposal. They don't put something together on the Budget Committee to actually counter what we're doing. So I have worked on being fiscally responsible. We'll continue to do that, but I think the indication that those deficit numbers are down, as well as since 2003, roughly 140,000 jobs a month are being created across this country. So to me, that indicates we're doing something right, and yet at the same time, I will agree with the fact you need to make government leaner and make it more responsible.
I think both parties, and I think every American expects that we have to get control of our deficit. Right now at $8.5 trillion of debt, and we own less than half of that now. Any number of countries can bring us to our knees without ever firing a shot. The deficit is not just a fiscal problem, it is a national security problem that will be more and more and more, and we need to understand that as for what it is. The whole national debt, of course you've got two sides of the equation. Let's look at the pharmaceutical Part D bill. $552 billion that's costing us as taxpayers, and that's going straight to the debt. It was nothing but a boondoggle for the pharmaceutical companies. Again, the theme of my campaign, the big billion-dollar lobbyists are running Congress. They're writing the legislation, and they're not writing it for you and me. They're writing it with their bottom line in mind, and they're becoming wealthier and wealthier and wealthier as we see our debt go up and truly a real squeeze on the middle class. The other side is on receipts. We have seen more and more tax cuts for very, very wealthy, more and more tax loopholes, tax cuts for huge, huge corporations, not the businesses that make up the 2nd District of Kansas, but I'm talking about the people who have the wealth and and the size to move their corporate headquarters to the Cayman Islands, and they are many at this point. So we're seeing, again, if you have a whole lot of money, you're able to avoid paying the taxes. That's shoved on to middle class people and businesses to try to pick up, but most of it's being shoved right onto the debt. And we can turn that around. We absolutely can start to find a better balance in that regard.
I think some interesting answers here, so let's go right to the panel. Tim?
Well, it appeared as if the congressman blamed Democrats for the deficit, and last I checked, the president was a Republican. We have House and Senate leadership are Republicans.
I can confirm that.
So I'm not sure why the minority Democrats would be at least wholly to blame for what's going on with the deficit.
And it should be noted that in the past several years, the Democrats actually have been shut out from conference committees regarding the budget and other issues. Literally, the doors have been locked against Democrats when they've tried to get into conference committees on budget issues. But, you know, so that's part of this equation.
Could be the Boyda's trying to appeal. This is a populist appeal. That
there is some populism there, yeah.
Well, what I mean is by her point about, oh, only the rich and the highly connected working through lobbyists are going to get the tax breaks that you don't get. So that might be reaching out to people who feel disenfranchised by the heavy lobbying that goes on in Washington.
Right, and neither of them address what is many analysts say is a real problem, not just with this Congress, but really in Congress in the last several years, which is the pork barrel spending added on to some of these bills for particular districts. But Peter, you had a comment?
Yeah, you were talking about the earmarks, yeah, and neither one of them really talked about that. I think what's interesting about this issue is how the issue itself about federal budget deficits has evolved over time. I think this really hit the national political debate in the late 1970s when we were talking about billions of dollars, first started seeing billions of dollars in budget deficits. And the fear at that time was that as the government borrowed money to operate, it took money out of the private sector economy, it raised interest rates, and therefore made it more difficult for businesses to formulate capital to make new investment, and it was a drag on the economy. What you heard Boyda talking about, and she was talking about it in the negative sense, was that we're now selling our debt to foreign nations. Some people, I think, would argue that now that we have this globalized economy, deficit spending by the federal government doesn't have that drag on the economy because there are foreign countries buying our debt, which in fact ties our economy to theirs. They're now invested in our economy and in our government, and so our success becomes their success. That could be, and I think as a result of that, the deficit is much more manageable, much less of a threat to the national economy than it was, say, in the 1970s. Now it seems to be an issue just because deficits are scary. Although the fear of big numbers.
Although there's still, particularly in the Republican Party, still a base that just does not like the deficit spending and is not happy with.
Well, they don't like government, big government, and they don't like government spending more money than it has.
It's spending beyond your means, and I think you know individuals don't have that freedom to do that. Why should our elected people?
Well, individuals do that.
Well, we want to make sure we get to the a couple more questions. And you can continue this after the show, I'm sure. But we couldn't think, obviously we can't think of all the questions that are pertinent. So we did ask the candidates what their top priority would be when they got into Congress, if they were elected, and specifically what bill they would want to champion and get sponsors from the Senate and try to push through in the next session.
My first bill that I would like to introduce is just because of my background. I've been in the pharmaceutical industry and the research and development side for over 20 years. I understand that business. Right now, community pharmacy, most people don't understand what's happening. I've watched it happen for years. Community pharmacy is absolutely being shoved out of the picture, and they provide a real valuable part of our healthcare team, especially in rural Kansas, and especially where we see more and more seniors and people getting older and older. It's predicted right now that we'll lose about 25% of our community pharmacists in the next 18 months if we don't change some legislation. Right now they're paying so low and slow that it's absolutely running these guys out of business, and they're good people, good people. Why do I care about community pharmacy? Because it's part of the healthcare team. But it's also this metaphor of what's going on. We're seeing again all the big guys get all the breaks and shoving our independent and regional businesses out. The wealth that used to stay in our communities is being shipped out. With community pharmacies, they're called pharmacy benefits managers, PBMs. People say, what's a PBM? I say, well, let me tell you. It's like a front-end loader that drives up in front of a community pharmacy. You put all the money that used to stay in the community in it, and you ship it to New Jersey. It is absolutely based on what's going on with policy in Washington, D.C. It's something that I feel passionately about, and as a freshman congressman, it's something that I uniquely bring that expertise to. But it's a model not for pharmacy, just for pharmacy. It's community pharmacy, it's family farms, it's the businesses that we have in this, up and down this district, that clearly need the support of the policies in Washington, D.C. They are reeling, just reeling, under high taxes. They are reeling under high health care costs and regulation. These are the people that we should be fighting for in the halls of Congress.
I don't know whether there's a lot of them, frankly. One would be lowering taxes on Social Security for seniors. I have a bill I've already started. We'll have to rework it again for helping seniors have tax credits for hearing aids. I've also been working one I would introduce again, and that is to level the playing field for our military in terms of low-income housing. Right now, it's leveled against them, or it leans against them. I've actually introduced a bill. We've gotten it through the Financial Services Committee with bipartisan effort. In fact, it was a unanimous consent to vote it right on through the Financial Services Committee. We've gotten to the House floor. We have some time left. I'm hoping I can still get that through. But, you know, those are some of the things I will continue to work on, making tax relief permanent. The marriage tax penalty and the child tax credit are set to expire because of an archaic rule within the Senate that's called the Byrd Rule, meaning after the tax package that we passed earlier on, if we don't make it permanent, those will revert back to what they once were, so that there'd be a lot of tax credits lost for families, for married couples, alternative minimum tax. Those kinds of things are things that I would like to continue to work on.
Well, we don't have a lot of time left in the program, but Rick, we saw specific answers from these two candidates on this question.
I was interested in the difference between Congressman Ryan talking about very, I think, traditionally Republican kind of stances, lowering taxes, providing tax relief, versus Nancy Boyda talking about kind of some broader issues about corporatization and so forth. I think that, obviously she's tried to paint the congressman as a Republican insider, somebody who's too close to the administration, and I wonder if by talking about these traditionally Republican things, he might be playing into that.
Well, yeah, we're going to get right, because I think we have time for one more question and leave a little time to talk about it. So what we did ask the candidates was something a little different. If they'd read the book, What's the Matter with Kansas? A lot of people have or have not, but because it has made such an impact on the national scene, we were curious as if these two candidates had actually read the book.
I did read the book. I read it, I don't know, probably a year ago. I read it after the last election. And much of what it says is accurate. We have a real values culture in the 2nd District of Kansas that what I didn't appreciate about the book was it made it sound like maybe Kansans are so stupid that they don't even know that they're voting against their economic best interest. And I just said, and I tried to tell people who read that, Kansans are not stupid. They know exactly what they're doing, and they're putting deeply, deeply held values ahead of things that they consider to be less important, which are actually their economic benefit. They're not unaware that they're doing it. And I think when anybody downplays the importance of issues like abortion and gay marriage, they'll do it at quite expense to their reputation. I believe that a woman should be able to make a decision in the first 3 months of her pregnancy. I don't consider that to be a radical view of abortion. I consider it to be pretty common sense. But when I talk to people who have that as their primary single issue, I always say to them, I understand how important it is to you. I don't try to convince them that their job is more important. And I try to respect that that's where they're coming from. And if somebody says to me that they think that an abortion right after conception is murder, I wouldn't even ask them for their vote. How could they vote for somebody that thinks that murder's okay? I don't see it that way. But we need to understand that good people see things differently. They want the same things. They're good Kansans. We need to stop diminishing each other's concerns and come together. And when we do, we'll have certainly a stronger state, and we'll have a stronger nation. But people in Kansas care passionately about many things, and I really respect them deeply for that.
Well, I've only heard bits and parts of it, to be honest with you, read little bits and pieces. To be honest with you, I tend to focus on the common sense values of Kansas. I think this is, it may sell newspaper stories, it may make print for those who are interested, but by and large, as I travel through the 2nd District, and especially in my campaign, I have great support from everyone within the party. Some that might be considered moderate, some that are considered, on the right side, independents, Democrats. So, I tend to look at the common sense values that Kansans have and work on what we have in terms of a common ground as opposed to the divisive things that are out there.
Well, another interesting set of responses. Should we start with Peter and keep it short, but we'd like to hit all three of you if we can.
I read the book. It was a good book. It wasn't a great book.
Made a lot of money, though.
Made a lot of money, and I think it made some important points that are worthy of discussion. And it seems odd to me that someone who makes their living and makes their career out of politics in Kansas could go along without not only not reading it, but not really understanding the central point. The point being, and you can agree or disagree with it, that the Republicans have used social wedge issues in order to attract middle class, working class voters to vote for Republicans, who then pass legislation against their interest.
Right.
I think Boyda got that. She mentioned she brought up abortion.
She did, yes.
And so I think she got your point there. It was interesting that the congressman believes that he has a broad base of support even among Democrats.
Or did he just say his own party?
He mentioned the D word.
Did he? Okay.
Yeah.
Rick?
I'm with Peter. You don't see that many books written about Kansas, so why not go ahead and read the one that's out there and that a lot of people are talking about. I was surprised a little bit that he hadn't read the book and maybe didn't know a little bit more about it.
Yeah, and I think our viewers will find both these candidates and their answers to be of great interest, which is why we did this program. Well, we're about out of time, and I'd like to thank our candidates for their participation. I'd also like to thank our panelists for being with us here tonight, Tim Carpenter, Peter Hancock, and Rick Anderson. We hope the information we presented will aid you in your decisions at the polls. For all of us here at KTWU, I'm Bob Beatty, and thank you for watching.